Content marketing. I'm not going to be the guy that says content is king, because you've probably heard that 3 times today already. But content is important, and it's increasingly important in 2015. So in this talk, what I want you to get from it is, if you're going to be investing in content in 2015, how to do better than you would otherwise, how to put data at the heart of your strategy, because without data and without understanding, it's hard to know what's working, what isn't, so it's hard to know how to improve. Because content, ultimately, is expensive. If you're doing it properly, if you're creating content like this, which is a piece by The Guardian on flights around the world in live time, which is a really cool piece. It's got thousands of shares and thousands of social engagements. Something like that, in terms of analysis, development, design, it doesn't come cheap. So you want to obviously minimize the risk of creating an expensive piece of content which might not work, and you want to make sure that if you do invest in something like that you get it to the right places and make it hold its value. Ultimately, what gets measured gets managed, which is a famous saying. Without measurement, without analysis, you can't properly manage your content marketing efforts, because how do you know what isn't working? And one thing with content marketing, excuse me, is you have to expect it to fail. It's a bit like the England football team. You have to expect your content to fail a little bit, and that's fine. You need to embrace that failure and accept that, which is kind of a weird thing to say. It's kind of hard for a lot of people, especially if you go to your marketing director, your CMO, whoever, and say, we're going to invest in this content, it might fail. They don't often like that. But having that embedded as a culture at the start is really important, because without expecting the failure, you can't test and learn. Basically, with content, you need to test, you need to learn, you need to improve, you need to optimize. And without having a little bit of failure in there, then you can't do that, ultimately. So it's a little bit like supporting England. It can be a little bit painful. But one thing you need to be aware of is the hippo, which is the highest paid person's opinion. It has no place in content marketing. So in a lot of marketing strategies, you'll get the boss overriding and saying, I think this, we should do this, because ultimately, they might not say it like that, but ultimately because I'm paid more than you. That doesn't matter here. What matters is having a robust strategy which you can test from, which you can learn from, and which everyone can develop from, because without that, you're just guessing again. So a little about me. I'm Ben Harper. I'm the co-founder of Datafy. We're a digital agency. We're just around the corner down there by the New York Times. I'm at BenHarper87 if you want to tweet me at all. We are a team of 4. Myself and Adam, Dean and Claire. We're all here today, so catch us. We cover data, insight, data analysis, content marketing in terms of creation, distribution, as well as sort of paid advertising and other services you'd expect from a full-service digital agency. But come and have a chat and get a bag and a book and so on. We work with some pretty cool people. So we work with the likes of Time Out London, we've worked with sort of Quipe in the past, Rocket Lawyer, some really cool brands across all this kind of stuff. So we've got the creds to back it up as well, is what I'm saying. So, content marketing, really important, and everyone here is probably going to invest in it in some way next year, I'd imagine. Here's our process. The content marketing process we use starts with data collection. These are all the points we'll cover in this presentation, but data collection is really important first step. Data collection allows you to know what you're doing the whole way through. The second step is audience insights. Ultimately, by understanding your audience, you can understand what kind of content to create, and you can minimize your risk and increase your chance of success. We'll go into that in quite a bit of detail in a minute. Once you understand your audience, it's all about strategy creation, which leads to campaign creation. Once you've got the campaigns created, you move into distribution, because as I was explaining to someone earlier, you can have the greatest piece of content in the world, but if you don't have a distribution plan, if you're not planning to put that content somewhere, then ultimately it's worthless. Then we move into optimization, and that's of the strategy and of the distribution. It's the whole thing, really. And then into reporting, because without reporting, you ultimately don't know what's worked. So that's the process we follow for all our clients, and works really well for us. So it starts with the content strategy, which revolves around the data collection and the audience insight. So there's 4 main sources of data for you to collect at this stage. First is from your own website. So this is our blog. This is a recent post about this. The kind of things you want to be collecting here are social shares, traffic, page views, all the relevant metrics which you can get in Google Analytics or Omniture or whatever analytics package you're using. The key data you can get from your website content, which you can't get from anywhere else, is conversion data. So obviously you can see your private data, your private metrics, so sales that have come referred through from content, inquiries that have come through referred through from content. You can't get that on the other data sources, so that's really important to pick up at this stage. Second is your competitor content. So that's really important. You want to know what your competitors are up to, what they're doing. If they're doing something better than you, you can perhaps develop on that idea a little bit. If they're doing things which you would otherwise consider but it's flopping, then that tells you maybe avoid that if they're using the same target audience. There's a number of ways to do that. You can do it fairly manually by going through their blog, their sites, their social media presences, and taking down all their data. It can be a bit painful, but it can be worth doing. There's a number of tools out there that can help you as well, which we can talk about later. But competitor content is quite a good way to gauge a content strategy. Next up is your external content. So we write a lot on, so this is a piece I've written for Content Marketing Institute, for instance. We write a lot on other sites, sort of as PR and so on. Metrics on those kind of sites and what people are engaging with in other environments is also really important. I would argue that all of these data sources are fairly equal. So if you are placing content elsewhere, you might have to search for that. You might have to use web mentions from the like of Open Site Explorer, for instance, where you can search for a mention of your brand and find every mention online to find that data. The next up is your social media content. So with social media, you can find everything out about a piece of content, ultimately. So from Facebook Insights, you can see whether a piece of content is being shared more than others. You can see the reach, you can see the visibility, you can see how your audience is interacting in terms of photo content, video content, text content, etc. And it just gives you a really good steer in terms of the what and the where, rather than anything more detailed at this stage. And ultimately, you want to get the data into something understandable, really. So we tend to use spreadsheets where we track all sorts of key metrics: Facebook likes, author, time, day of the week, shares, traffic, sales, everything we can. Ultimately, if you can't hear me, sorry. Is that better? Better, sorry. So ultimately, if you have all of that data, you have it in a usable way, then you can ultimately analyze it, which is the key. Because without having it in a format where you can analyze it, you can't really do a lot with it. So don't collect data for the sake of it, collect it with an end goal in mind, and you're on the right path. Ultimately, once you've got that data, you can start to pull out insight in terms of graphs for learning a lot more. Obviously, seeing things in a graphical way helps us learn a lot better. So for example, this is performance by day on a certain blog. This shows page views as the bars and number of posts as the lines. As you can see, there's an awful lot of page views on a Sunday, but very little content on a Sunday. So instantly that tells you, okay, in my content strategy, I probably need to post more on a Sunday. Basic things like that, which otherwise you probably wouldn't see. But having that data, pulling it out, visualizing it, helps you see that really quick. You can do the same with categories. So if you categorize your content in terms of when you create it, you can categorize it, you can tag it, depending on if you're using WordPress or so on, or if you just do it when you're pulling that data out. If you categorize it then. So for example, here again, you can see there's an awful lot of content being created on startup-related topics, but they're not getting that many page views proportionately. So that might say you're creating too much content there. It's all just to give you indicators at this stage. You can also look, this is an example of some social data. This shows you interactions by day versus your competitor. Again, once you've got that kind of data and you're comparing it, you can see, okay, my competitor's outperforming me in that middle section. What have they done? So it might be what have you done wrong, it might be what have they done well, but you won't identify that at all without pulling that data out first. That brings us on to a concept called content affinity, which we've talked about a lot today. So content affinity basically is all of that previous information gives you the what, the where, the basics. Not the basics, basically, not the real context that you need to create a strategy. This is the audience insight step, and this is where it gets really interesting. In essence, content affinity is the affinity that a specific audience has with certain pieces of content. So in essence, imagine if you knew what your target audience engaged with most over the last 3 months in terms of tone of voice, in terms of day of the week, in terms of specific content types, in terms of specific content. that gives you a lot of information straight off the bat in terms of creating your strategy. Basically, in essence, what we're doing is taking a load of social data and comparing it to an audience and analyzing it in a certain way. You can do this on a basic level using tools like Facebook Audience Insights. That lets you see like affinity based on brands for like 20 brands. So it'll say, your audience are 10 times more likely to like Red Bull or something like that, which is fine. Our way gives a lot more data, and it works for owned and competitive audiences, which is really useful. So here's an example, for instance. So for example, with this kind of insight, we can say that 56% of the target audience that we're looking at engage with sports content. That's a start, that's fine. But then we can also say 40%, 45% of this engagement is related to event attendance, for instance. And you might go to say that the target audience engage with content most after 8 p.m. The target audience are 12 times more likely to engage with London-specific content. So they're fairly random examples, but that shows you the kind of insight you can get. And we're pulling out fairly straightforwardly for our customers, and that means that kind of insight, when you pull it out in a certain way, allows you to create a strategy based on understanding your audience. Because otherwise, again, you're still kind of guessing a little bit. You might understand that you need to post more on a Sunday, but you don't know what to post about until you understand the audience. When you understand the audience, you can start to put them into personas, ultimately, which is what we do. So we'll categorize people into segments based on what we know about them from Audience Insight, what the business goals are, ultimately, in terms of who we're trying to attract and why. And once we know, we'll normally group into sort of 4 or 5 sets of people. They might be loose sets, it might not be purely demographic, it might be based on income or lifestyle or any number of things. But we group those people so that we can tailor content around them. And ultimately, all of that information should be brought into your content ideation, brainstorm process. There's a lot of ways to brainstorm. You can all sit in a room and shout at each other. You can write things on notes and pass them around. Whatever works for you is fine. But having that data to inform that creative is really important. Because without the data, again, you're just wildly going out there. And creativity is fine. Creativity is good. But we believe that having data around it to inform it and to constrain it a little bit so that you're in the right target market is the most important thing. So just so you know, we tend to just sit in a room and brainstorm it out. We sort of go through it together, but we always have that data in the middle of the room so that we can always refer back to it and ensure that we're hitting the target audience based on what we've found. So once you've done the data collection, the audience insight, and you've done the brainstorm, you're in a position to create your content strategy. Ultimately, that should be normally a shared kind of content calendar, just saying what you're going to do over time, when, why, detailed out so you can follow it, and that's fine. Ultimately, then you've got to create the content, and that can be painful depending on exactly what you're doing, and can be video and infographics and interactive content. It really depends what you're doing. Whatever you create, the distribution is the most important next step. Obviously, the content has to be good, but as I said before, if the content is brilliant, but you don't distribute it, then it's not really going to do anything for you. So, in terms of content distribution, the biggest thing people seem to think these days is that if you build it, they'll come. If you're the Guardian, like that piece I showed you earlier about the flights, then maybe they will. If you're a big enough brand, then maybe they will just come. But for a lot of us, most normal-sized businesses, or anyone who's not sort of a super business or a super media site, just having a piece of content isn't enough. You need to push it out there. And a lot of people think content marketing doesn't work because they'll create the content and just leave it there and expect it to work. So you need to distribute it, but how? Well, there's a number of ways. There's press releases, there's social media, there's guest posting, there's any number of ways of getting your content out there. None of them are right or wrong. It all depends on exactly what you're trying to do. But the key is to make sure that you are optimizing what you're doing, and again, using data to inform where you're going and where you're placing content. So we do a lot of content testing at this stage. I guess most of you are familiar with sort of A/B testing and so on of websites where you can change certain elements and so on to see what converts better. We do the same with our content. So if you take the example of, I guess you're probably familiar with like BuzzFeed and Upworthy and the big viral content sites. They do a lot of this. If you ever speak to them, they basically test about 10 headlines at least for each post because they know that the headline is the most important thing. They know that that will affect the click-through rate massively, the conversion rate through to what they're trying to get you to do. We use content distribution to do this for our content. So ultimately what we'll do is create a piece of content, and then distribute it in different ways with different headings and different call to actions to see which resonates with the audience best in terms of getting the audience to the content and how they then react to the content. So there's a number of ways to do this. First is through Facebook ads. Facebook ads are brilliant, to be honest. It's one of the most cost-effective ad platforms out there right now. Targeting is brilliant. And when you have the level of data we do in terms of social data, we can target it really well. But one thing you can do is, obviously you can do newsfeed ads which aren't shown on your page. You can then show these with different titles, different descriptions, and see which one works best in terms of click-through rate and engagement, and instantly you're learning a lot more about your content. It's really cost-effective. Facebook ads, you're looking at somewhere around 20, 25p a click, normally on average. Depends on your audience, but that's kind of the standard rate we see. And it's quick, it's easy, it's cheap, it's just a no-brainer to test your content in that way. Next up is Twitter ads. Again, works in the same way. You can do sponsored tweets now, self-service. You're looking at £1.10, £1.30 cost per engagement they'll normally charge you. And again, structuring a tweet in a short amount of characters allows you to find out exactly in a really short way what's going to work for your customers in terms of what they want to read, how they want to engage with your content. And then there's placing the content on other sites, so the press release side of things. So effectively, we use a tool called BuzzStream, which is really good for collecting all of the sites you want to outreach to and just put content on. It allows you to pull in all their metrics in terms of their sort of traffic estimations, their social shares, their SEO metrics like domain authority and PR and so on. It's a really useful tool. It allows you to qualify the sites, contact the sites, keep it all in a big database effectively. And again, what you want to be doing here is filtering. Basically, the key reason why we use this, other than just it being a database, is it pulls in the metrics. It allows us to see which sites are good, which sites aren't. It allows us to filter. It allows us to optimize based on tags and so on, so that we can constantly improve where we try to get our content placed and where we ultimately do get our content placed. And that leads us to getting really good placements. So, for example, we get content on really good sites like The Guardian, like on Social Media Today, like on the Financial Times, and all sorts of different sites. By building those relationships based on understanding what people want and where best to place the content. Thank you. Sorry, I'm dying from a cold. Next, we move on to ongoing optimization, which should go through every single part of this strategy. So in terms of your strategy, as I said, you should expect it to fail. And for it to fail, you need to optimize it so that you can make it better. In terms of your content creation, again, pieces will fail. You need to optimize your process and make it better. In terms of the distribution, some channels will work, some won't. You need to learn from that and get better. And the only way to learn and get better is to have a testing environment and to optimize. Well, so as I said, expect to riff up your strategy on more than one occasion. Expect to completely throw it out, potentially, if it's really not working. Hopefully, if you've done the data collection and strategy creation first, then it won't come to that because you've based it on something. But if you haven't, then that can happen. Hopefully you won't come to that, but hopefully you'll just be tweaking your strategy. So your failures hopefully will be small. And it all comes back to this. It all comes back to the data. So the better the data you have here, the more you can test, the more you can learn, the more you can optimize, and the better you can make it. So without the data, you can't test and learn, you can't improve your strategy properly. So as we mentioned earlier, in that instance, we're going to post less on a Sunday. Or post more on a Sunday, sorry. And that's quite straightforward. That's a really easy, simple insight which you wouldn't have picked out without having that data necessarily. You might have just guessed about your content and you wouldn't know that. It all comes down to optimizing every step, so having data everywhere. And the key is pulling that audience insight out. That's where things get really interesting in terms of making a difference. So if you know exactly what your audience want to engage with, you know where they go, what they do, what content they interact with, you're in a much better position to create a content strategy than you otherwise are. And then everything else should fall into place. So we've got a whole book on this over at our stand called The Role of Data in Your Content Marketing Strategy, which covers all of that in a lot more detail. And with a number of other sections. You can pick a physical version up at our stand, or you can download it at datafy.co.uk/resources. We're on stand A50, not A34, ignore that. And yeah, if you have any questions about content marketing, then I'm happy to answer them now or later at the stand. But yeah, visit our site. There's an awful lot of resources on there to help you at each step of this. We've got templates around marketing budgets and around content creation, which will really help you out. Thank you.